think about history for a moment. Really think about it. We have this story we tell ourselves about human progress. It's neat and orderly and makes sense. We were hunter-gatherers for thousands of years, living in small groups surviving off the land. Then agriculture happened, and everything changed. We built cities, created writing systems, developed civilizations. Rome, Egypt, China, all these mighty empires rose and fell, but they rose and fell in ways we can trace, in ways the historical record actually documents. Except there's a problem with that story. A big problem. A really unsettling problem that gets worse the more you look at it. Because the historical record isn't nearly as complete as we like to pretend. There are gaps. Enormous, terrifying gaps where entire civilizations vanish. Periods where knowledge just disappears. Times when humanity seems to have forgotten how to do things it clearly knew how to do just a few generations before. We're not talking about missing documents or archaeological mysteries in some remote location. We're talking about 10,000 years of human history that has been lost, fragmented, erased, or forgotten so completely that we can barely reconstruct it even when we find the ruins staring us in the face. There are centuries where we go from advanced societies to primitive ones, with nothing in between to explain how that happened. There are millennia where entire technological systems vanished overnight and people had to reinvent the wheel, literally and figuratively. There are gaps so complete that civilizations of millions of people left almost no permanent record that they'd ever existed. And here's what really keeps me up at night about this. Most of these gaps aren't accidents of preservation. They're not just bad luck that burned the libraries or let the documents rot. Many of them are the result of catastrophes so severe, so complete, that the people living through them couldn't do anything but survive. Which means somewhere in those lost centuries are answers to questions we don't even know how to ask anymore. Technologies that were invented and then forgotten. Knowledge systems that developed over generations and then vanished in a single decade. Stories and histories that were written down, memorized, passed through oral tradition, and then lost when the people who carried that knowledge died in epidemics or famines or wars. We're living in the aftermath of these catastrophes, all of us, and most of us don't even realize it. If you're settling in to fall asleep right now, this is exactly the kind of content I make for that. The mysteries that don't demand solutions, just contemplation. The questions that have been waiting for thousands of years so they can wait a little longer while you drift off. Maybe hit subscribe if you want to explore more of these lost corners of history with me, and tell me in the comments where you're from, what time it is where you are. I love seeing the global map of people thinking about these same mysteries all at once, all over the world, because that's what connects us to all those lost civilizations, isn't it? That same human curiosity, that same need to understand where we came from and what happened to the people who came before us. Let's journey together into those gaps, those 10,000 years nobody can fully explain. Imagine standing at the edge of the last ice age, 12,800 years ago. The glaciers that have dominated the northern hemisphere for nearly 100,000 years are finally retreating. Temperatures are warming. Life is returning. Humans are thriving. Your ancestors have learned to hunt the enormous animals that roam the grasslands. Mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths. They've learned to process wild grains and make beer from them. Some groups have built permanent settlements. They're not farmers yet, but they're on the verge of something. Maybe agriculture, maybe cities. The trajectory is pointing upward. Civilization is starting, and then everything stops. Within 50 years, within a human lifetime, the entire trajectory changes. Temperatures plummet. Not gradually like they've been rising, instantly, geologically speaking. The glaciers surge forward again, forests die, grasslands turn to tundra, snow that hasn't melted in 1,000 years falls again. The animals your people have depended on for millennia start disappearing. Mammoths, gone. Mastodons, gone. Giant sloths, gone. Saber-toothed cats, gone. Cave bears, gone. In North America alone, more than 35 species of large mammals go extinct in just a few hundred years. That's not a gradual decline. That's a systematic extinction event, and it happens right when human populations are reaching their peak, right when they're developing more sophisticated settlements and social structures, and the people living off these animals, they face starvation. This is the Younger Dryas. It lasted 1,300 years, from about 12,800 to 11,600 years ago, and it may have been caused by something that fell from the sky. Some scientists think a comet or asteroid broke apart in the atmosphere above the North American ice sheet, creating an explosion that triggered climate collapse. The evidence is controversial, but it's intriguing. A thin layer of sediment from exactly the right time period. Nanodiamonds that only form under extreme heat and pressure. Shocked quartz crystals. Platinum group elements rare on Earth but common in space rocks. Mainstream geologists argue the evidence is ambiguous, but something catastrophic happened during this period. Something that reset human civilization. The sophisticated cultures that had been developing before the Younger Dryas didn't completely vanish, but they were devastated. The Clovis culture of North America, those sophisticated big-game hunters who'd spread across 2 continents, their distinctive tool technology just disappears from the archaeological record. Gone. Replaced by simpler, more localized cultures. It's like someone pressed a reset button on thousands of years of accumulated knowledge and social complexity, and we have almost no written records of what happened, no survivors' accounts, no historical documentation, just archaeological evidence of abandonment and collapse, just the evidence of animals disappearing and human populations declining. Because here's the thing about the Younger Dryas. It happened right at the boundary between prehistory and history, between oral tradition and written record, between the world we can barely see and the world we can document. Whatever advanced knowledge existed before the Younger Dryas, whatever people might have figured out about astronomy or mathematics or navigation, whatever stories they told about their own origins, most of it vanished. Not because people couldn't remember it, because the people died, because communities were scattered, because the social structures that transmitted knowledge collapsed under the weight of catastrophe. And here's what keeps many archaeologists up at night about this. We keep finding evidence that humans before the Younger Dryas were more sophisticated than we used to think. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, 11,600 years old, with massive T-shaped pillars weighing 20 tons and elaborate carvings. Some researchers think this place required coordinating hundreds of workers, organizing massive labor projects, developing shared cultural traditions and religious beliefs to justify such effort. The Natufian culture in the Levant, building permanent stone villages 15,000 years ago, harvesting wild grains so systematically they might have been on the verge of inventing agriculture on their own. They had specialized tools, grinding stones, storage systems. They understood botany well enough to manage ecosystems. The people of the Green Sahara, living in regions now completely uninhabitable, building monuments we barely understand, possibly tracking celestial events, possibly counting seasons and predicting climate patterns, and then the climate changed and most of it disappeared, which raises an uncomfortable question. How much did we lose? What knowledge was being developed in the areas that are now underwater? the continental shelves that were above water during the Ice Age but got flooded when the glaciers melted. Those coastlines would have been the most productive, most densely populated regions. If humans were building monuments and organising large communities, that's where you'd expect to find it. And now it's hundreds of feet underwater, probably destroyed beyond recovery. We're looking at history with entire civilizations missing from the record, erased not by time or forgetting, but by literally rising sea levels that drowned the evidence. The knowledge gaps that haunt human history aren't just about what we've lost by accident. Sometimes they're about what we've lost on purpose, or through catastrophe so severe that the people living through it couldn't do anything but survive. In medieval Europe, for instance, the Western Roman Empire collapsed around 476 CE, and what followed was a period we call the Dark Ages, though historians hate that term. It's dark not because nothing was happening, but because our ability to see what's happening almost completely breaks down. Writing disappears. The written records drop from hundreds of documents per decade to maybe a handful per century. In some places, literacy vanishes almost entirely. How does that happen? How does a civilization go from being the most documented, most literate, most bureaucratic empire in the Western world to a place where nobody knows how to read in just a few generations? The answer is that literacy isn't natural. It's not something that survives on its own. It has to be actively maintained by institutions, by teachers, by people who see value in passing it along. In Rome, literacy existed because it was economically useful. You learned to read because you needed those skills for government jobs, for trade negotiations, for keeping records, for conducting business. But when the cities collapsed and people moved to the countryside to farm, literacy became useless. Worse than useless, it was a waste of time. Why spend years learning Latin when you could be learning to grow food, to build shelter, to keep yourself alive? So people stopped teaching it. Parents didn't pass it on. Teachers disappeared. Schools closed. Within 2 generations, children grew up illiterate. Within 3, literacy was basically gone from the entire Western European population. By the time medieval Europe stabilized, writing had become something rare and precious, something only clergy and nobility bothered with. The knowledge of how to read was preserved mostly in monasteries, where monks painstakingly copied manuscripts by hand. But the vast majority of the population simply couldn't read. That's a gap in human knowledge that lasted for centuries, not because the information wasn't available, but because nobody thought to teach people how to access it. But here's what's really disturbing. The knowledge that literacy held, all of that was recorded. It was in books, on scrolls, carved into stone. The information didn't have to be lost. The Romans left behind detailed manuals about engineering, about architecture, about making concrete that would last for centuries, about building aqueducts that could transport water across hundreds of miles, about surveying land and doing mathematics and constructing buildings that wouldn't collapse under their own weight. All of that technical knowledge was written down, preserved, documented. But if nobody could read the manuals, if nobody had the mathematical education to understand the proportions and calculations, the knowledge might as well not have existed. It was useless without the literacy infrastructure to support it. So the people of medieval Europe stopped building in stone. They forgot how to make Roman concrete, that remarkable mixture that would actually improve with age, that could be mixed underwater. They forgot how to construct aqueducts and maintain the water systems that had made cities possible. Structures that had been built centuries before, structures that represented some of the greatest engineering achievements of their time, were simply abandoned, left to decay. And instead of maintaining them or building new ones, people built in wood like their ancestors had before Rome ever came to their lands. It's like watching a civilization go backward 2,000 years in less than a century, just because the ability to read disappeared. Because there's the social structures that valued and transmitted technical knowledge collapsed. And the worst part is how fast it happened. It wasn't gradual. Within a few decades of Rome's collapse, the infrastructure was breaking down. Within a century or two, the knowledge was gone. The practical understanding of how to build these structures had to be held in people's heads, transmitted from master to apprentice, maintained through continuous practice. Break that chain through plague, warfare, or social collapse, and it vanishes forever. We know this happened because we can see it in the archaeological record. Roman buildings being stripped for materials, settlements abandoned, the material culture becoming suddenly simpler, cruder, more primitive. But the written accounts of what was happening during this time, those are almost non-existent. We don't have the perspective of the people living through the collapse. We don't know what they thought was happening. Were they aware their civilization was ending? Did they think the chaos would be temporary? Were they trying to preserve knowledge? We can only guess from scraps of evidence and stories written down centuries later by people trying to make sense of a dark period they'd already mostly forgotten. And this same pattern, this same tragedy, repeats across human history. Knowledge lost, not through lack of information, but through loss of the social structures needed to transmit and maintain that knowledge. There's a particular kind of frustration that comes from studying civilizations we can see but can't understand. The Indus Valley civilization is the perfect example. This is one of the largest ancient urban cultures in the world. At its peak around 2300 BCE, it covered an area larger than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. It stretched across over 500,000 square miles. It probably had a population of several million people. It had sophisticated cities with planned streets arranged in grids, advanced drainage systems, public baths, multi-story buildings, standardized weights and measures suggesting a unified economic system, extensive trade networks that reach from Afghanistan to the Arabian Gulf. There's evidence of a civilization that was probably more advanced in many ways than contemporary civilizations in Egypt or Mesopotamia, urban planning that wouldn't be matched again for centuries, sanitation systems more sophisticated than most medieval European cities, trade goods from thousands of miles away indicating networks as complex as anything in the known world. And we can't read their writing, not a single text. Not one inscription that we can confidently translate. We have over 4,000 inscribed objects, mostly small seals, but the inscriptions are incredibly short, usually just a handful of symbols. The longest known inscription has only 26 symbols. Without longer texts, without a bilingual document that could provide a key, the script remains completely opaque. We don't know what the symbols mean. We don't know if it's even a true writing system representing spoken language, or just symbolic notation like modern corporate logos. We have beautiful, intricate, completely mute artifacts, physical proof that an enormous civilization existed, proof that they had a writing system, but no way to understand what they were trying to communicate. The frustration intensifies when you think about everything we could know if we could just read their words. Their government system, their religious beliefs, their social organization, their history, their mythology, their stories. All of it is locked away in a script we can't decipher. We could understand why they built cities with such standardization. We could learn about their trading practices, their diplomatic relations, their daily lives. We could read their poetry, their prayers, their jokes. All of that information exists, captured in symbols, waiting just out of reach. And it's not like we haven't tried. Scholars have been attempting to crack the Indus script for over a century. They've used statistical analysis comparing it to known languages. They've used computer algorithms trying to identify linguistic patterns. They've studied the symbols from every conceivable angle. But nothing has worked because the fundamental problem remains. We're trying to learn an entire language from what's essentially a collection of business cards and shipping labels. No lengthy text, no grammar to analyse, no way to cross-reference one document with another, no Rosetta Stone to provide a key that could unlock the whole system. The civilization itself is still mysterious too. We know they had cities, but where were their kings? We find evidence of trade and commerce, but where are their markets? We see standardized housing across dozens of sites, suggesting a unified cultural system, but where's the palace complex or the evidence of a ruling class? Maybe they had a more egalitarian society. Maybe they were ruled by merchant councils or priests. Maybe their power systems were so different from what we expect that we're misinterpreting the archaeology entirely. But we don't know. We're guessing. And then around 1900 BCE, the civilization begins to decline. By 1300 BCE, it's essentially gone. The cities are abandoned. The cultural unity breaks apart. And there's a gap in the historical record. For centuries, we have almost no evidence of who the Harappans' descendants were or where they went. Some probably migrated east toward the Indus Valley. Some probably integrated into local populations. But the specific history, the transitions, the movements, all lost. And when the Vedic culture emerges around 1500 BCE, bringing Sanskrit and completely different religious and cultural systems, we can't trace a clear connection to what came before. It's like an entire civilization was erased and replaced. The gap remains unfilled despite all our modern technology and analytical methods, because some knowledge once lost might be impossible to recover. The tragedy of the Indus Valley isn't just that we don't know what happened, it's that we don't even know what we don't know. There might have been an entire philosophical tradition we'll never understand. There might have been mathematical innovations that wouldn't be rediscovered for centuries. There might have been artistic movements and musical traditions and stories that were created and lost without ever being recorded in any form we could access. All of it locked away in symbols we can see but cannot read. Then there are the gaps created by deliberate erasure, by colonization, and the deliberate suppression of indigenous histories. In Africa, civilizations built massive stone structures, controlled vast trade networks, created complex artistic and cultural traditions. But when European colonizers arrived, they denied that Africans could have created these things. They claimed the structures were built by Phoenicians or Arabs or lost civilizations, maybe even by visitors from space. Anything except the obvious truth that indigenous African peoples built them, and in the process of denying African accomplishment, they erased African history. The oral traditions that might have preserved knowledge about these civilizations were dismissed as mythology and superstition. The artifacts were looted, and placed in European museums with no regard for context or preservation of knowledge. African children were taught that their ancestors had no history, no accomplishments, that civilization began when Europeans arrived, and entire centuries of sophisticated civilization, of accomplished societies and complex cultures and technical innovations were written out of the historical record. It's not that the knowledge was lost to time, it was deliberately suppressed and erased by people with the power to shape what counted as legitimate history. Great Zimbabwe, one of the most impressive stone structures in the ancient world, stood for centuries at the center of a kingdom that controlled gold trade networks. But when archaeologists finally proved it was built by indigenous Africans, most of the oral history that might have explained how it functioned, how it was organized, what its society was like, it was already lost. The chain of transmission had been broken by colonization, forced displacement, and cultural suppression. Now we're left with magnificent ruins whose cultural context is largely gone. And the tragedy is that this happens over and over. Kush, the powerful civilization that ruled parts of the Nile, and even Egypt itself, developed its own writing system, built pyramids, created a sophisticated culture. But we can't read their script. The knowledge was lost so completely that even their own descendants couldn't remember how to interpret it. The Nok culture of Nigeria was smelting iron at a level of sophistication that would have been revolutionary, yet we know almost nothing about who they were or how their society functioned. Medieval West African empires controlled trade networks that made them wealthy and powerful enough that even distant European kingdoms heard about their wealth. But internal records, the accounts from their own historians, these are mostly lost or fragmentary. And worse, there was active suppression of African historical knowledge during the colonial period. Libraries weren't just neglected, they were burned. Oral historians weren't just dismissed, they were silenced. Archaeological sites were looted rather than studied. The result is that vast stretches of African history remain obscure, understood only through fragments and outside observers' accounts. But they're not necessarily lost forever. They're just waiting to be recovered, studied, and properly documented by people willing to take seriously the evidence of African sophistication and cultural achievement. There's a particular kind of melancholy that comes from knowing that somewhere in the Pacific Ocean, there are answers to questions we can barely formulate anymore. The Polynesian expansion, the settlement of the Pacific Islands, is one of the greatest feats of human exploration in history. Between about 1200 and 1600 CE, Polynesian voyagers in wooden canoes found and settled nearly every inhabitable island in the Pacific Ocean, a region covering roughly 64 million square miles. They travelled thousands of miles across open water, locating islands that were sometimes less than 10 miles across, surrounded by hundreds or thousands of miles of empty ocean. They did this without compasses, without sextants, without any of the instruments that European navigators would later think essential for ocean crossing. They used star navigation, reading wave patterns, watching birds, paying attention to clouds. They memorized the positions of hundreds of stars and understood exactly which ones rose and set at different points on the horizon, depending on latitude. They read bioluminescent organisms in the water, understanding how their patterns change near islands. They tracked ocean currents and swell patterns with a sophistication that wouldn't be matched by European navigators for another 1,000 years. They knew the flight patterns of birds and how far they travelled from land. They understood how weather patterns changed near islands even when those islands were still below the horizon. But here's the problem. Most of this knowledge was already being lost by the time Europeans arrived in the Pacific. The great age of Polynesian exploration had ended centuries before. The routes that had once connected islands across thousands of miles had largely been abandoned. The traditional navigation knowledge survived in only a handful of places, mostly in Micronesia, and what we learned from those survivors in the 20th century, we still don't know if that represents the full extent of what was known during the height of the Polynesian expansion. We know some of their techniques, but we don't know all of them. We don't know what we've lost. We can't even fully explain how they navigated across such vast distances with such accuracy. And the individual stories, the specific accounts of voyages and discoveries, the history of particular island settlements, most of that is gone. We have archaeological evidence, we have genetic evidence showing settlement patterns, We have linguistic connections between island populations, but we don't have the narratives. We don't have the names of the great navigators or the stories they told about their discoveries. That knowledge was preserved in oral tradition, and oral traditions are fragile. They require continuous transmission. Break the chain through disease or warfare or forced cultural suppression, and they vanish. And the Pacific Islands experienced all three of those catastrophes. European contact brought diseases like measles and smallpox that devastated populations that had no immunity. Some islands lost 90% of their people within a generation. In that catastrophe, knowledge holders died. Elders who remembered the old stories, navigators who knew the traditional routes, priests who understood religious traditions. They all died, and the knowledge died with them. Now we're left trying to reconstruct Polynesian history from fragments. DNA evidence showing genetic contributions from unexpected sources. Linguistic analysis revealing connections between languages that shouldn't be connected if our traditional theory of settlement is correct. Archaeological sites on remote islands that prove people lived there centuries before we thought they did. Each discovery raises new questions about voyages we know must have happened, but which left almost no permanent record. We know Polynesians reached Easter Island, but we don't really understand their society. We know they carved massive stone statues. We know they developed a unique writing system. But the details of their social organization, their political systems, their daily life, most of that was lost even before European contact, erased in transformations and conflicts that nobody recorded. And somewhere in those lost centuries of Pacific history are answers about how humans mastered one of the harshest environments on Earth, how they developed technologies and knowledge systems that allowed them to cross an ocean larger than all the continents combined, how they created societies and cultures on remote islands with limited resources. Those answers are waiting beneath the waves, preserved in genetics and in the fragments of oral tradition that survived, but they're increasingly hard to recover. And every year that passes, more of the elders who might remember traditional stories pass away without passing on what they knew. Here's what's particularly haunting about human history. It's not just the individual civilizations we've lost or the knowledge we can't recover. It's the evidence that the gaps keep getting bigger, that every time we've experienced a major catastrophe, we've lost more than we've saved. And looking backward through geological time, we can see that humanity has been through catastrophes far worse than the ones we remember in recorded history. 12,800 years ago, the Younger Dryas didn't just affect one civilization or one region. It affected the entire planet. It reset human development. It destroyed populations, killed species, transformed the environment, and we barely remember it. It's been lost in the deeper past, barely documented, mostly absent from historical consciousness. But before that, there may have been other catastrophes we don't even know about. Other resets, other population collapses, other losses of knowledge. The geological record suggests that humans have been on the planet for hundreds of thousands of years, but our written history only goes back about 5,000 years. What happened in those hundreds of thousands of years before writing? What societies rose and fell? What knowledge was developed and lost? We have some archaeological evidence. We have DNA evidence. We have genetic markers showing that humans spread across the globe, reached distant islands, adapted to every environment from deserts to Arctic tundra to tropical rainforests. But the specific histories, the individual stories, the names and deeds of the people who accomplished these things, almost all of that is lost. And it's lost not because people weren't intelligent or capable. It's lost because the circumstances were harsh, because knowledge systems were fragile. because the social structures needed to preserve information were vulnerable to catastrophe. We tell ourselves that civilization is permanent, that progress is inevitable, that once we've figured something out, we won't forget it. But history suggests otherwise. It suggests that knowledge is fragile, that civilizations are vulnerable, that the systems we've built to preserve information can fail catastrophically, and when they do, entire worlds of knowledge, entire histories, entire ways of understanding the past can simply vanish. We're living in the aftermath of those losses, all of us. We're inheriting a fragmented history, trying to make sense of ruins and artifacts and incomplete records, trying to understand societies we can see but can't fully comprehend. And there's something deeply humbling about that, because it reminds us how much we don't know, how incomplete our understanding is, how much might be waiting in those gaps if we ever figure out how to look there properly. The questions that haunt human history aren't really solved by evidence. They're just complicated by it. The more we learn, the more we realize how much we don't know. But there's something comforting in that, in knowing that mystery persists, that we're still at the beginning of understanding our own story as a species, that there's so much left to discover. We have technology that would have seemed like magic to our ancestors. We have satellites and ground-penetrating radar and DNA analysis and computer algorithms that can process vast amounts of archaeological data. And yet there are still entire civilizations we know almost nothing about. There are still periods of human history where the record is almost completely dark. There are still questions about our own past that we can't answer. And maybe that's okay. Maybe it's even necessary, because it keeps us humble. It reminds us that knowledge isn't fixed or complete. It's always provisional, always subject to revision when new evidence emerges. So if you're still with me, if these gaps and mysteries have followed you into the darkness of your thinking, I hope they're the kind of mysteries that help you fall asleep. The kind that don't demand immediate solutions but just invite contemplation. The kind that remind you that for all our technology and all our knowledge, we're still trying to piece together a story that might never be completely understood. So settle in. Let these lost centuries wash over you. Think about the people who lived in those gaps, who experienced those catastrophes, who preserved what knowledge they could. Think about the navigators reading stars on empty oceans, the scribes recording information in scripts we still can't read, the builders constructing monuments whose purposes remain mysterious. Think about all those voices echoing across time, trying to tell us something about who they were and what they knew. And know that somewhere in those spaces we can't quite see, the answers are waiting, not urgently, not demanding, just waiting. Preserved in rocks and sediment and DNA and linguistic patterns and oral traditions that are slowly being recovered and documented, and maybe someday we'll find them. Maybe you'll be part of the generation that figures out what those ancient symbols mean, or discovers a lost city, or pieces together another fragment of our incomplete history. Maybe you'll be part of the generation that figures out what happened in those missing years, or discovers the next buried city, or pieces together another fragment of our incomplete history. Because the truth is, we are not just the species that remembers, we are the species that forgets. And we forget in ways that are so consistent, so predictable, that you can almost map them like weather patterns. Not because anyone wants to forget, not because humans are careless, but because knowledge is fragile in the way living things are fragile. It has to be fed, it has to be taught, it has to be practiced, it has to be repeated until it becomes instinct, and then it has to be passed forward again into new minds, in new bodies, under new skies. And when that chain breaks, even briefly, something strange happens. The past doesn't vanish, it becomes inaccessible, like a locked room with the furniture still inside, covered in dust, waiting for a key that no longer exists. If you're listening to this to fall asleep, good. Let your breathing slow. Let your shoulders drop. Because the easiest way to understand this is to stop thinking of history as a smooth river and start thinking of it as a series of campfires in the dark. Each fire is a community, a city, a school, a guild, a temple, a family line. And around each fire there are songs and techniques and maps and rules and memories, but fires can go out, wind can hit, rain can drown the coals, people can scatter. And when that happens, knowledge doesn't always move cleanly from one fire to the next. Sometimes it jumps as a spark, sometimes it's carried carefully, ember by ember, through generations, and sometimes it dies completely, leaving only the faint smell of smoke in the air and a feeling, just a feeling, that something used to be here. There are different ways a fire dies. Sometimes the sky does it, sometimes the earth does it, sometimes other humans do it, and sometimes we do it to ourselves, slowly, without realizing it, by changing what we value and what we bother to learn. Sometimes the loss is sudden, a shock, a night where the horizon burns and the smoke is so thick that the morning sun rises pale and weak, and by noon the streets are empty. That kind of loss is easy to imagine, because it fits the human love of drama. A city sacked, an archive destroyed, a palace collapsing in an earthquake. But there is another kind of loss that is quieter, and it may be even more common. The loss that happens when the institutions that carry knowledge become unprofitable, unfashionable, or simply irrelevant to survival. When the world shrinks, when trade routes fracture, when money disappears, when security becomes the priority, when people stop travelling and stop building and stop trusting. In those moments, it's not that people become less intelligent. It's that the structure that made certain kinds of intelligence useful collapses, and without that structure, skills can fade like footprints in snow. And then there is the most haunting kind of loss of all, the loss that happens even when nothing spectacular breaks, the slow erosion of continuity, the way an art can become a parody of itself over centuries, the way a ritual can survive long after the original meaning is forgotten, the way a technology can degrade into a myth, and then into a symbol, and then into a blank space, where all that remains is the feeling that something used to be there. So if you want to understand the missing ages, you have to look at the mechanisms of forgetting. You have to learn the anatomy of collapse. You have to ask not only what might have existed, but what would have been required to keep it alive. Because knowledge is not a treasure you bury once and then dig up intact. It is more like a muscle. If you don't use it, it weakens. If you don't train it, it disappears. And when an entire society stops using certain knowledge, because it can no longer afford the time, because it no longer needs it, because the people who carried it are gone, that knowledge can vanish faster than you'd think. And once you start thinking like that, you begin to notice something unsettling. History has had multiple moments where it didn't just lose a single city, or a single dynasty, or a single library. It lost a whole network at once. It lost the invisible infrastructure that made complex life possible. Trade routes, diplomatic channels, specialist classes, standardized weights and measures, writing systems, bronze production chains, the delicate logistics of turning ore into tools, into weapons, into agriculture, into population growth. And when that infrastructure collapses, the world does something that feels almost impossible to a modern mind. It simplifies, rapidly. Not in the sense that people become primitive overnight, but in the sense that the web of interdependence snaps, and each community is forced to survive on what it can produce locally. And that shift from add complexity to local survival, can erase entire categories of knowledge, not because they were wrong, but because they were expensive. One of the clearest examples of this, one of the most chilling, is the Late Bronze Age collapse. Picture the Mediterranean and Near East around 1300 BCE. The world is humming. Not in the modern sense, not with electricity and engines, but with something that feels almost modern when you step into it. Connectivity. Palaces in Mycenaean Greece, writing inventory lists on clay tablets in a syllabic script. Egyptian diplomats exchanging gifts with foreign kings. Merchant ships moving along coasts with cargo holds full of luxury goods and practical necessities. A bureaucratic world of seals, archives, messengers, treaties and letters. A world where rulers recognize each other across hundreds of miles, where they send each other gold and brides and threats and apologies, where a city on the coast can depend on grain from somewhere else, copper from somewhere else, tin from somewhere else, tea, timber from somewhere else. A world with a spine made of trade, and the key material that binds this world together is bronze. Bronze is not just a metal, it is a system. It is copper plus tin, and copper is relatively widespread compared to tin. Tin is the problem. Tin is the bottleneck. Tin is the rare ingredient that forces you into trade, because if your region doesn't have tin, you must obtain it from somewhere else. And that means you must maintain connections, you must keep routes open, you must secure alliances, you must protect caravans, you must know which ports are safe and which passes are blocked, you must have translators and accountants and guards. In other words, your ability to make bronze, your ability to arm soldiers, to make tools, to maintain agriculture, depends on a network of fragile relationships. Now imagine what that does to a civilization. It means complexity becomes dependent on threads you cannot see. A drought in one region can affect grain shipments. A war in another can block a pass. A pirate fleet can cut a coastal route. An earthquake can destroy a port. A rebellion can topple a palace. And because everything is connected, the shock propagates. One failure triggers another. A supply chain breaks, and a palace cannot arm its soldiers. Soldiers cannot be paid, so loyalty fractures. Grain cannot be distributed, so unrest spreads. Craftsmen lose their livelihood, so they scatter. The administrative class cannot enforce order, so local strongmen emerge. The world doesn't fall like a single statue. It crumbles like a wall that was held together by mortar you didn't know was there. This is what the Late Bronze Age collapse looks like when you stop thinking of it as a single event and start thinking of it as a system failure. And it is not just one kingdom that falls, it's multiple at once, across a wide region. The Mycenaean palace centres decline. The Hittite Empire disintegrates. Cities along the Levant are burned. Trade networks weaken. Diplomatic correspondence fades. Entire regions enter what later historians will call Dark Ages, not because people vanish, but because the written and administrative machinery that produced dense historical records stops producing them. Imagine the scribes in a palace archive. They are not philosophers, they are clerks. They are recording how many jars of oil were delivered, how many sheep were counted, which workers received rations. Their tablets are mundane, and that is exactly why they matter. Because mundane records are the signature of a stable system. The ability to track surplus is the ability to coordinate. The ability to coordinate is the ability to feed specialists. And specialists are what create complex technologies and architectures. A society that can support scribes can support engineers. A society that can support engineers can build large coordinated projects. A society that can build large projects can dominate its landscape. But all of that depends on the quiet machinery of administration, the boring routines, the predictable flow of goods. Now imagine the day the palace burns. The tablets are still there, ironically, because clay survives fire. In fact, it survives better when it's baked. But the people who can read them are gone. The bureaucracy is gone. The network that made writing useful is gone. And without that network, writing can disappear even if the medium survives. A writing system can die not because the marks are forgotten, but because the social role that made literacy valuable collapses. If there is no palace to manage, no centralized surplus to track, no long-distance diplomacy to maintain, the incentive to train scribes vanishes. Literacy becomes a luxury, a curiosity, a useless skill. And this is one of the strangest aspects of collapse. When a society becomes smaller and more local, literacy can become pointless. If you're no longer sending letters across empires, if you're no longer maintaining centralized inventories, if your world shrinks to a valley and a few neighboring villages, you might not need scribes. You need farmers. You need hunters. You need people who can repair roofs, tend animals, defend the settlement. And so, a script can vanish within a few generations, not because it was inferior, but because the economy that made it valuable fell apart. So the Bronze Age collapse is not just ruins and ash, it is a lesson in how fast complexity can unwind, and it invites a question that should make you uneasy. If a world that connected Egypt to Anatolia to Greece to Mesopotamia could collapse into local fragments, what else has collapsed that we never saw? What other networks existed and failed before anyone had the means to record them in a way that survives? How many times has the wheel been reinvented because the chain that carried the last version snapped? Now the causes of the late Bronze Age collapse are still debated, because it doesn't fit neatly into one explanation. There are signs of drought and climate stress in some regions. There are signs of earthquakes. There are signs of war and destruction. There are references to raiders, sometimes labelled sea peoples, moving along coasts and attacking cities. There are internal rebellions and political instability. There is the basic fact that when systems become highly connected, they can become fragile. You don't need to pick one cause to feel the shape of it. You only need to recognize that in a connected world, stress can cascade. One weakness can pull on another, and when multiple stresses arrive close together, the system can tip. But you don't need to pick one cause to understand the deeper meaning. The deeper meaning is that complexity is not permanent. It is something you have to keep paying for, and the payment is stability, surplus, coordination, and trust. Remove those, and the system can revert. And when it reverts, knowledge collapses with it. Not all knowledge, not human intelligence, not the ability to build and invent. People keep living. People keep making tools. People keep telling stories. But certain kinds of knowledge, large-scale administrative knowledge, high specialization crafts, long-distance engineering, standardized systems, those can drop out of a society's memory because the society no longer has the structure to support them. Now let's step forward in time, because the late Bronze Age is not the only moment where the human world suddenly dimmed. Sometimes the dimming is literal, sometimes the sun itself seems to fail. There is a period in the early medieval world that historians sometimes describe with a kind of stunned understatement. The sky becomes strange, the sun becomes weak, summers become cold, crops fail, hunger spreads, and then disease follows. Around the year 536, multiple sources describe a kind of veil over the sun, a persistent haze, a year where daylight feels wrong, where shadows look faint, where the seasons misbehave. Whether the cause was one massive volcanic eruption, or multiple, or a combination of eruptions and other events, the effect seems to have been a climatic shock that rippled across regions. Temperatures drop, harvests struggle. The rhythm of agriculture, which is usually dependable in a way humans build their entire lives around, becomes unreliable, and again you don't need the exact geophysical details to understand what this would do to knowledge, because knowledge is not preserved in times of hunger. When food fails, everything contracts. People stop building, they stop maintaining, they stop funding schools and monasteries and workshops, they stop copying manuscripts, they stop training apprentices, they stop travelling, they stop trading, they stop taking risks. When hunger comes, the horizon shrinks. The world becomes the next meal. And in that kind of world, the first things to go are the fragile long-term projects that keep culture continuous. Think about it. A scribe copying a text is not producing calories. A teacher training students is not producing calories. A scholar debating philosophy is not producing calories. Those activities are supported by surplus, and surplus is supported by reliable agriculture, trade, and stability. When the harvest fails, the margin disappears. And when the margin disappears, a society begins stripping away anything that is not immediately necessary for survival, not because it hates learning, because it is trying not to die. So when climate shock hits, it is not just bodies that suffer, it is the entire web of cultural reproduction. And then, as if hunger is not enough, disease can arrive. In the mid-500s, the Justinianic plague begins to spread through parts of the world. Again, the details and exact patterns are complex, but the broad reality is simple: massive mortality. And when mortality spikes, it does something unique to knowledge. It doesn't just remove random individuals, it removes nodes. It removes the few people who held specialized skills. It removes the teachers, the master craftsmen, the navigators, the healers, the translators, the librarians, the people who are the living memory of systems. And when those people die, knowledge can die with them, not because no one could ever rediscover it, but because the continuity breaks. Imagine a guild where only a few masters know a technique, and apprentices learn by watching. Imagine a monastery where only a few monks can read certain texts, and those texts exist only in a few fragile copies. Imagine a court where only a few diplomats know the languages needed to maintain treaties. Imagine a port where only a few shipbuilders know how to shape hulls for certain seas. Now imagine a plague taking those individuals. In one season, a knowledge chain that took centuries to build can snap. And the world can continue. Humans are resilient, but it can continue in a simplified form. And this is the part that feels like a hidden rule of history. Catastrophe does not just destroy what exists, it changes what can exist afterward. It lowers the ceiling for a while, until stability returns, until surplus returns, until networks rebuild, and then, slowly, complexity can climb again. But the climb is not guaranteed to recreate the same peak, because knowledge is path-dependent. If you lose the old path, you might build a different one. You might reinvent a wheel, but not the same wheel. You might build a bridge, but not the same bridge. You might write a new script, but not the old script. So each collapse is not just a pause. It is a branching, a divergence, a world line splitting into a different version of human culture. Now, there is another kind of forgetting that is even more eerie, because it is not caused by sky or famine or disease. It is caused by intention, the deliberate cutting of memory, the decision, sometimes by a ruler, sometimes by an ideology, sometimes by an invading power, that the past is dangerous, that the past must be erased, because the past gives people alternative ways to understand the world, and alternative ways to understand the world are threats to those who want control. So throughout history you see moments where knowledge is attacked not as collateral damage, but as a target. Books burned, archives destroyed, languages suppressed, schools closed, priests and scholars killed, not because they were physically powerful, but because they were powerful in a deeper way. They carried memory, and memory is authority. This is why conquering powers often try to rewrite history. They know that controlling the story controls the future. If you can convince people that a certain past never existed, you can convince them that certain possibilities never existed, that certain identities never existed, that certain claims to land, to legitimacy, to value never existed. Now, sometimes this is done bluntly. A new dynasty rises and destroys the records of the old. A conqueror arrives and burns the local archives. A religious reform sweeps through and labels old texts heretical. A state decides that certain ideas are too destabilizing to survive, but sometimes the erasure is subtler. A language is discouraged until it fades. A script is replaced until no one can read the old one. A class of scholars is defunded until it disappears. A school system is restructured so that children never learn the old stories. And within a few generations the past becomes illegible. Not because it is gone, because no one can read it. This is the most chilling type of forgetting. The past still exists, sometimes literally on stone or paper, but it becomes silent. Now imagine an empire trying to unify itself. Multiple dialects, multiple regional identities, multiple philosophies, multiple competing texts. For a ruler, this is chaos. Unity requires standardization. Standardization requires suppression of alternatives. And so you get moments where states attempt to simplify culture, sometimes violently. You see efforts to consolidate scripts, consolidate histories, consolidate permissible ideas. Sometimes this looks like a policy that later generations remember as book burning. Sometimes it looks like the destruction of unapproved texts. Sometimes it looks like the elimination of scholars who resist. And whether the intent is absolute control or simply administrative stability, the outcome can be the same: diversity of memory collapses. Now think about what that does to a society's capacity. If you destroy alternative schools of thought, you may lose methods. If you destroy local records, you may lose engineering knowledge tied to a specific region. If you destroy language diversity, you may lose access to entire literatures. And in many cases what survives is not necessarily what was most useful or most insightful. It's what aligns with power. So history becomes biased, not just by accidents of preservation, but by violence. Now let's bring this into a more intimate scale. Imagine a single book, a manuscript copied by hand. It takes months, maybe years. It's expensive, it's fragile. It exists in 1 or 2 copies in a region. If that manuscript is burned, it might be gone forever. Not because the knowledge is impossible to rediscover, but because the specific expression, the specific insights, the specific style of mind behind that book is gone. And even if the knowledge is rediscovered later, it might not be rediscovered in the same way. It might not connect to the same chain. It might not inspire the same developments. So every deliberate act of destruction is not just loss, it is a distortion of what comes next. Now, keep this in mind because it leads to one of the most important and overlooked reasons we know what we know about the ancient world. It is not always because some cultures were more literate or more advanced. Sometimes it is because some cultures accidentally chose a storage medium that survives. Some wrote on stone, some wrote on clay, some wrote on papyrus that rots. Some carved in durable rock that can sit in the ground for millennia. Some kept archives in dry deserts. Some kept archives in humid forests that devour organic material. So the past you inherit is not a fair sample, it's a filtered sample, shaped by physics and chance and violence, which means there are whole civilizations we might understand only as faint shadows, not because they were faint, but because their records were made of materials the planet recycles quickly. And this is where the story becomes almost cruel. A fire that burns a library of papyrus destroys it. A fire that burns a room of clay tablets might preserve them. The same event, destruction, can erase one culture's memory and immortalize another's, simply because of what the words were written on. So when you look at history and you see some societies speaking loudly through thousands of preserved documents, and others barely whispering through a few scattered artifacts, remember this. It may be less about who mattered, and more about what survived. And survival, in the archaeological sense, is not always connected to greatness. It is connected to material, to climate, to accident, to the particular way a building collapsed, to whether a city was buried dry or submerged wet, to whether a script was carved into stone or painted onto something that fungi love. Think about the irony of that for a moment. Imagine the scribes of Mesopotamia pressing wedge-shaped marks into damp clay. They are not trying to create eternal monuments. They are trying to keep track of barley deliveries, tax obligations, temple offerings, land disputes, marriages, debts, practical paperwork for a practical world. And yet, because clay is stubborn, and because fire turns soft clay into ceramic, a surprising amount of that paperwork survives. Whole piles of receipts and letters and legal arguments. School exercises where a student practices signs again and again. Personal complaints that still feel human when you read them. A man writing to someone about a missing shipment. Someone else asking for help. Someone else arguing about property. The small everyday machinery of life frozen by accident into the future. This is why the ancient world can feel lopsided when you study it. It's why Mesopotamia can speak in thousands of voices, while other regions seem to speak through stone monuments alone. It's why we can read contracts and complaints and school exercises from some places, and from others we get only the official voice. Kings, gods, victories, temples. The everyday world disappears, and when the everyday world disappears, you begin to misjudge the people. You begin to imagine they were only what their monuments proclaim. You begin to forget that they had arguments and jokes and boredom and bureaucracy and normal days. And now let's return to deliberate erasure, because there is something almost surgical about it. In some moments of history, a ruling power looks at the past and sees a competing blueprint. The old texts contain alternative laws, alternative cosmologies, alternative genealogies, alternative claims to legitimacy. And the fastest way to prevent rebellion is not to kill rebels. It's to prevent people from even imagining rebellion as legitimate. That is why controlling memory is so powerful. If you control the story of who has always ruled, you control what feels possible. If you control the story of what the world is, you control what people think they are allowed to want. So you can understand why some regimes have tried to standardize thought. Imagine a state that wants uniform administration across vast territory. You need consistent measurements, consistent scripts, consistent laws, consistent records, and that means regional variation becomes an enemy. Dialects become inconvenient. Local histories become inconvenient. Philosophical diversity becomes inconvenient, because diversity creates friction. It creates multiple loyalties. It creates multiple interpretations of authority. So you get moments where an empire attempts to compress the mind of its population into a single channel. Sometimes it does this gently through education policy and incentives. Sometimes it does it violently. Sometimes it targets not only texts, but the people who keep the texts alive. And the terrifying part is how fast it can work. A writing system can vanish in a few generations if children stop learning it. A literature can become dead if it is no longer copied. A scientific tradition can evaporate if its apprenticeship chain is broken. And once the chain is broken, later generations might not even know what they are missing. They will not wake up and feel the absence of a lost equation. They will simply build their world with the tools they have, unaware that other tools ever existed. This is why deliberate erasure is not only a tragedy, it is a kind of time weapon. It reaches forward. It changes the shape of the future by amputating a branch of the past. And sometimes the erasure is not done by a state that thinks it is evil. It is done by a state that thinks it is rational. Because from the inside, standardization can feel like progress. We are unifying the country. We are eliminating superstition. We are removing dangerous ideas. We are bringing order, and order can be good. Order can reduce violence. Order can stabilize trade. Order can create prosperity. But the hidden cost is diversity of memory. The hidden cost is the extinction of alternative ways of thinking. Now, shift your mind to another scene, far from imperial courts. Imagine a priest or scribe in a city in the Americas before European conquest, not just writing as decoration, but as a system, recording calendars, ritual cycles, genealogies, astronomical observations, agricultural timing, stories that are also data, and those texts are not carved in stone. They are in codices, folded books made from bark paper or similar materials, painted with glyphs and images. Now imagine conquest arriving, not just disease and warfare, but a collision of cosmologies, a new religion labeling local knowledge as demonic, a new administration labeling local records as illegitimate, a new order that cannot read the old script and does not want to, so the books burn. Not all at once, not in a single cinematic scene, but across years, across regions, through repeated acts of confiscation, destruction, and disinterest. And in many cases the tragedy is not only that the books are destroyed, it is that the people who can read them are killed, converted, scattered, or forced to abandon their role. So even if some texts survive physically, they can become mute. The ink remains, the glyphs remain, but the voice is gone. This is another form of extinction, not biological extinction, though they often accompanies it. Cognitive extinction. A way of seeing the world goes silent, and we should be careful here, because the past is never pure. No culture is a perfect utopia of knowledge, but the point is not to romanticize. The point is to recognize how much can be lost when a knowledge system is dismantled. A civilization can be reduced to ruins and tourist myths, while the deeper intellectual architecture, its mathematics, its medicine, its astronomy, its philosophy, disappears almost completely. And this is why the gaps in our understanding of the ancient Americas can feel so vast compared to what might have existed. Not because nothing was there, but because the library was attacked, and then the landscape was transformed, and then centuries passed, and then the survivors had to build new lives under new constraints. So when we look back and ask, why don't we know more? The answer is often painful. Because someone made sure we wouldn't. Now let's move again, because deliberate destruction is only one blade. There is another blade that cuts knowledge quietly, translation. Because even if a text survives physically, it can still die if it is not translated forward. Languages change, scripts evolve, meanings drift. If a culture loses access to an old language, its older literature becomes like a sealed vault. And unless there is a continuous tradition of teaching that language, the vault stays sealed. Think about how many civilizations have left inscriptions that we can see but not read. Stones covered in symbols, tablets filled with marks, scripts that look structured, clearly meaningful, but stubbornly silent. Every undeciphered script is a reminder that preservation is not enough. You can have the artifact and still lose the message, because the message lives in interpretation, and interpretation lives in communities. So knowledge is not just stored in objects, it is stored in living networks of teachers and readers and practitioners, and that brings us back to the main truth again, the one that keeps returning like a refrain. Knowledge is a process. It has to be done again, every generation, or it fades. Now, if you're still awake, you might feel the weight of this, but it's a gentle weight, like a blanket, because there is something strangely comforting about realizing that history's gaps are not mysterious because humans were weak. They are mysterious because humans are human. We build, we lose, we rebuild, we forget, we remember again. And the next part of this story, the part that will matter for everything that follows, is that modern science has begun to develop ways of recovering history even when the texts are gone. We can read the past in things that don't look like writing at all. We can read it in tree rings, in ice layers, in pollen grains, in bones, in DNA, in the geometry of buried foundations, in the chemical signatures of ancient fires. But before we step into those tools, before we step into the modern detective work, it's worth letting one final thought settle into you. Every time you read history, you are reading what survived. Not necessarily what mattered most, not necessarily what was most advanced, not necessarily what was most beautiful, what survived. And survival is biased. Survival is selective. Survival is a lottery run by climate, material, violence, and chance. So when you see a dark age in the record, remember, the darkness might be in the archive, not in the people. The people were still there, still living, still making choices, still telling stories. The paper just turned to dust. The teachers died. The chain broke. And then, centuries later, someone found a shard, or a buried room, or a burnt tablet, and we tried to rebuild an entire world from the remaining fragments, which is what we're still doing now, quietly, patiently, one recovered line at a time. So let's keep going. Let's follow the evidence in the places where ink cannot survive. Let's move away from libraries and into landscapes, into the cold storage of glaciers, into the sealed archives of lake beds, into caves where soot clings to stone for tens of thousands of years. Because if the human story is written in gaps, then the only way to read it is to learn how to read what the earth itself has been quietly recording, layer by layer, while empires rose and fell above it. Because the earth is a recorder, not a perfect one, not an honest one in the way we want history to be honest, but a recorder all the same. It takes whatever happens on its surface, fire, flood, drought, harvest, war, migration, industry, and it presses a faint imprint into layers of mud, layers of ice, layers of ash, layers of dust. It lets forests write in pollen. It lets oceans write in shells. It lets bodies write in bones. It lets viruses write in DNA. And most of the time, it writes without words, which is why we didn't notice the record for so long. We kept looking for libraries. We kept looking for inscriptions. We kept looking for monuments, because those are the kinds of memories humans know how to make. But the planet has been keeping its own archive all along. So now, when we walk into a jungle and see only green, we don't have to accept that the past is gone. When we stand on a plain and see only grass, we don't have to accept that nothing ever stood there. When we stare at a coastline and imagine it has always looked that way, we don't have to accept the illusion. We can learn to read what the earth is quietly storing. And the way we do that is strange. It doesn't look like archaeology the way you were taught to picture archaeology. Not always. It's not only men with brushes, kneeling in trenches, carefully revealing pottery shards. That still happens, and it matters. But now the work also happens in labs with humming machines. It happens on computers with maps that glow in impossible colours. It happens in clean rooms where scientists wear gloves and masks like surgeons, because the past is fragile and modern contamination is everywhere. It happens in the dark, in the quiet, in the slow, patient process of translating the Earth's language into something a human mind can understand. So imagine this. You're standing at the edge of a forest that looks endless. Thick canopy, vines, heat, green layered on green, the kind of landscape that seems designed to hide things, and for centuries, that landscape has been doing exactly that. Trees rise, die, fall, rot. The soil eats wood, the humidity eats paper. The jungle is not only alive, it is hungry. It consumes the traces of human life the way fire consumes dry leaves. And yet, beneath that canopy, there might be a city, not a mythic city with golden towers, a real one. Stone foundations, platforms, causeways, reservoirs, a grid of human intention hidden under centuries of vegetation. And if you walk through the jungle on foot, you might pass within meters of it and never know. Because you are looking at leaves, you're looking at trunks, you're looking at vines, your eyes are trapped at ground level, but now we have a way to look through the leaves, not with magic, with light. A plane or a drone passes overhead, carrying a device that sends countless pulses of laser light downward. Those pulses hit the canopy, hit branches, hit leaves, and some of them bounce back. But some of them slip through gaps and they reach the ground, and when those pulses return, the machine measures the time it took. It creates a dense cloud of points, millions, billions, each one a measurement of distance, and then, after the flight, you take that cloud of points and you filter away the vegetation, you subtract the forest, and what remains is the shape of the ground itself. And on that ground, suddenly, you see lines that nature does not make. You see long straight edges, right angles, terraces, ditches, raised roads. The ghosts of architecture in the terrain, a city revealed not by digging, but by removing the illusion of greenery. This is one of the most unsettling feelings modern archaeology can give you. The feeling that the world is full of invisible cities, cities that never truly vanished. They simply became unreadable to the naked eye. So when someone tells you there is no evidence, you begin to hear the hidden question underneath. No evidence. In what medium? Because if the evidence is in the shape of the ground under a living canopy, you need the right kind of vision to see it. You need to learn the language, and when you do, the past starts to reappear in places we once called empty. Now, as you listen, let that image settle into you, a hidden city emerging from a digital subtraction of forest, because it's a metaphor for what's happening to history itself. We are learning how to subtract noise, we're learning how to remove the layers that hide the signal. And the signal is everywhere. It's in deserts too. Deserts feel like the opposite of jungles, where jungles erase by overgrowth, deserts erase by exposure. They sandblast, they bury, they reveal and then bury again. Wind moves dunes like slow waves. A city can be swallowed and then partially uncovered centuries later like a bone surfacing in sand. And deserts are also places where certain kinds of preservation become possible. Dryness can keep organic materials intact that would rot elsewhere. But deserts also distort because they can make us think the past is more visible than it truly is. We see a ruin in a desert and we say, look how well it survived. forgetting that thousands of other ruins might exist in wetter climates, but have dissolved into nothing. So now, in deserts, we use another kind of seeing: satellite imagery, patterns that reveal themselves only from above, old riverbeds etched faintly into the land, ancient canals, roads, fields, walls, the geometry of agriculture that no longer exists but still slightly alters the way vegetation grows after rare rains. The past leaves a fingerprint in the way moisture collects, in the way soil compacts, in the way heat rises at night. And when you start looking for those fingerprints, you realize something. Humans have been reshaping Earth for a very long time, not only in the industrial era, not only with fossil fuels and cities that glow at night. Even in deep antiquity, humans dug canals, built terraces, redirected water, cleared forests, burned grasslands, planted orchards, managed herds, altered ecosystems. We were never passive occupants. We were always interacting, always changing, always leaving marks. It's just that many of those marks are subtle, and the Earth has been smoothing them. So modern archaeology becomes a kind of forensic science. You don't just find objects, you find traces, you find disturbances, you find anomalies that suggest a human hand once intervened here. And then you follow those anomalies like a scent. Now let's leave the air and go into the ground. Because some of the most powerful records are not in the ruins themselves, but in what accumulates around them after they are abandoned. Take a lake, a calm, dark lake that has existed for thousands of years. Every year particles settle into its bottom, dust from the air, pollen from plants, ash from fires, tiny fragments of organisms, chemical signals of temperature and rainfall. The lake becomes a slow collector, a quiet bowl catching whatever falls into it. And because the bottom of a lake is low oxygen and undisturbed, layers can build up like pages, year after year, decade after decade, century after century. If you drill down into that sediment and extract a core, you pull up a cylinder of time, and in that cylinder you can read changes. You can see when forests expanded and shrank by looking at pollen types. You can see when fires increased by counting charcoal fragments. You can infer droughts and floods from chemical ratios and particle size. You can see human agriculture appearing when certain plant pollens spike. Grains, for instance. You can see erosion increasing when forests are cleared and soil washes into the lake. You can see the landscape becoming more disturbed when humans intensify land use. And suddenly, a period that seemed like silence in written records becomes loud in the lake. Because the lake doesn't care if you had scribes, it records anyway. So, a dark age becomes a measurable shift. More charcoal, less tree pollen, more erosion, different species composition. The Earth telling you that something changed even when human texts stop speaking. Now take that idea and move it north, into ice. A glacier is another archive, but colder, cleaner, more brutal. Snow falls. It traps whatever is in the air. Dust, volcanic ash, chemical traces, even tiny bubbles of atmosphere. Then more snow falls. Over time it compresses into ice. Each layer holds a sample of the air from that year, that season, that storm. And if you drill deep into an ice sheet, you can pull up a core that stretches back tens of thousands of years. In that ice, you can read volcanic eruptions because they leave acid signatures and ash particles. You can read changes in temperature through isotopes. You can see shifts in atmospheric composition. You can see when the planet cooled or warmed, not as a story, but as a physical reality preserved in frozen layers. This is one of the strangest things about modern science. We can literally hold ancient air in our hands. Bubbles that formed when humans were hunting megafauna. Bubbles that formed when cities rose. Bubbles that formed when empires fell. and in those bubbles the atmosphere is preserved like a time capsule. So when we talk about sudden climate events, we are not always relying on myths or vague references. We can see the chemical fingerprint. We can see that something happened. We can see a volcanic winter. We can see a dust veil. We can see a shift in the planet's breathing. Now, remember the period we mentioned earlier, years when the sun seemed dim. If a major volcanic eruption injected aerosols into the atmosphere, ice cores can show that. They can show the timing, the magnitude, the chemical signature. Not in a way that feels like a dramatic story, but in a way that feels more convincing, because it is indifferent. It is not written by a frightened person trying to interpret omens. It is written by physics. And when you pair those physical records with human records, chronicles, crop failures, famines, disease outbreaks, you begin to see how deeply human history is tied to climate stability. Not because climate dictates everything, but because climate sets the baseline. It determines how reliable agriculture can be. It determines how predictable rivers are. It determines how much surplus a society can generate. And surplus is what funds everything beyond survival. So when climate destabilizes, the cultural machinery that preserves knowledge begins to wobble. And the Earth's archives can show you the wobble. Now we need to go even deeper into something that feels almost like science fiction. Ancient DNA. Because once you can extract genetic material from bones and teeth, history begins to speak through biology, not through inscriptions, through lineage, through ancestry, through the hidden record of who had children with whom migrated where, who replaced who mixed with who vanished. For most of human history, populations moved without leaving written explanation. People travelled, merged, split, expanded, collapsed. And we can infer some of that from artifacts and language. But DNA adds a different kind of clarity. It can reveal patterns that objects alone might not. Imagine a scientist in a lab, working with a tiny fragment of bone. They have to be careful, because modern DNA is everywhere. Your skin sheds cells constantly. Your breath contains moisture and particles. A single careless touch can contaminate a sample, so they work in controlled conditions. Clean air, protective gear, sterilized tools. They grind the bone into powder. They dissolve it chemically. They extract fragments of genetic material that have survived, broken into pieces by time. Then they sequence those fragments and try to assemble a picture. And sometimes what emerges is shocking. A population that archaeologists thought was continuous turns out to have been replaced or heavily mixed with newcomers. A migration that left almost no obvious artifact signature becomes visible genetically. A disease that wiped out a community leaves traces in the pathogen DNA preserved in teeth. A family line reveals relationships across regions that were assumed to be isolated. DNA can turn a silent period into a dynamic one. It can show movement where we assumed stasis. And movement matters because migrations can carry more than people. They carry technologies, they carry languages, they carry myths, they carry crops, they carry pathogens, they carry new social structures. So migration is one of the engines of cultural change, and when you can see migration clearly, you can begin to reinterpret history's transitions. Now, there's another unsettling truth DNA reveals. Humans have interbred with other human lineages, not metaphorically, literally. It means the story of our species is not a clean branching tree with neat separations. It's a braided river, with channels that split and rejoin, with currents that merge, with sediments mixing. And those mixtures can carry adaptive traits, immune responses, metabolic variants, maybe even subtle physiological differences that mattered in specific environments. So when you listen to your own breathing, when you feel your own skin, when you consider your own body's quirks, remember, you're not only modern human, you're a mosaic of deep ancestry, and that mosaic was shaped by environment. Cold, disease, sunlight, altitude, scarcity. So DNA becomes another Earth archive, not stored in ice or mud, stored in you. Now, let's shift to something that seems almost poetic in its irony. Some of the most powerful texts from the past were erased and then partially overwritten. Scribes reused parchment. They scraped old ink away and wrote new words on top. Paper and parchment were expensive, so older manuscripts became raw material. And when that happened, history didn't vanish completely. It became layered. A palimpsest. A text beneath a text. For centuries, those erased words were invisible. People could guess something was underneath, but they couldn't read it. The past was present, trapped beneath another past, like a voice muffled under thick cloth. But now we have ways to see ink that cannot. Multispectral imaging. Different wavelengths of light revealing differences in chemical composition. Ink that looks identical in visible light can separate under infrared or ultraviolet. Faint traces of old writing can re-emerge when the right frequency illuminates it. So a lost text can return, not fully, not cleanly, but enough to bring back a fragment of mind that was supposed to be erased. Imagine how that feels. A scholar thought extinct speaking again. A line of reasoning resurfacing after centuries of silence. It's not just information, it's resurrection. And the larger meaning is the same as with LiDAR and ice cores. The past is not always gone, it is hidden in a format we didn't know how to read. Now let's go underwater, because the ocean, as we said, is a thief. It stole coastlines, it drowned plains, it swallowed migration routes, it erased campsites that were once on shorelines, but the ocean also preserves in its own way. It can cover things gently with sediment, sealing them away from oxygen. It can turn a landscape into a capsule, and as underwater archaeology advances, the drowned world begins to reappear. Not as a myth, but as a map. Sunken river valleys, submerged caves, coastal settlements now far offshore, old forests preserved under waterlogged conditions. And when you think about sea levels at the end of the last ice age, you realize something that can change the way you imagine prehistory. Large parts of what we call continental shelf today were once living land. People could have walked there, hunted there, camped there, buried their dead there, built structures there, and then the water rose slowly but relentlessly, turning their world into seabed. So our sense of where humans could have been is skewed. We assume inland because inland survives, but ancient humans often lived along coasts because coasts are rich. They offer fish, shellfish, birds, marine mammals, salt, trade routes, navigable travel. Coastlines are highways and pantries at the same time, so the first chapters of many migrations may be submerged, which means the missing age is not always missing because it never existed. It's missing because it's underwater, and this doesn't only apply to the end of the Ice Age. Coastlines have shifted repeatedly. Tsunamis have rearranged shorelines. Storms have eroded and rebuilt. Tectonic uplift and subsidence have changed regions. The ocean is dynamic. So underwater archaeology is like exploring an entire second planet beneath our own. A planet that contains human traces we have barely begun to chart. Now as you listen, notice what's happening to the theme. We started with forgetting, with collapse, with deliberate erasure, and now we are moving into recovery. Not recovery in the sense of we can bring it all back, because we can't. But recovery in the sense that we are learning how to reconstruct, how to infer, how to rebuild a picture from fragments. And that changes the feeling of the mystery, because the mystery is no longer just a void. It becomes a kind of fog, and fog can be navigated. Now, there's one more tool, one more line of evidence that is almost absurdly small. Microfossils, tiny organisms that leave shells, diatoms, for example, in aquatic environments, or foraminifera in marine sediments. Their distributions shift with temperature, salinity, nutrient levels. So by studying which species appear in which layers, you can infer environmental conditions at specific times. It's like reading a thermometer hidden inside ancient ocean mud. And again, this matters for human history because humans are tied to ecosystems. If the ocean shifts, fish populations shift. If fish shift, coastal human diets and settlement patterns shift. If rainfall shifts, agriculture shifts. If agriculture shifts, cities shift. So you can use these tiny organisms as proxy signals to understand the stage on which humans were acting. And when you understand the stage, you can interpret the drama. Now notice the pattern. All these tools are indirect. They don't give you a paragraph of text that says, in the year this happened, people migrated south and abandoned their cities. They give you traces. They give you probabilities. They give you signals. So the work becomes interpretive. It becomes detective work. It requires humility, because signals can be ambiguous. A spike in charcoal could mean climate-driven wildfire, or it could mean humans burning land. Often it's both. A shift in pollen could mean warming, or it could mean humans clearing forests. Often it's both. A genetic replacement could mean migration, or it could mean a long, slow mixing process. Often it's not a single wave, but many, so you have to be careful. You have to avoid turning every signal into a dramatic story. But the signals are still profound because they reveal what text cannot. They reveal that the Earth has a memory. Now let's take one of these tools and let it become a story you can feel. Imagine a valley. Once it was forested, then humans arrive. They clear some trees, not to destroy, but to create space. They plant, they build, they keep animals. Over decades, over centuries, the forest's pollen decreases in the record and grass or crop pollen increases. The soil erodes more because roots no longer hold it as tightly. The lake at the valley's bottom begins to receive more sediment. Charcoal increases because humans use fire to manage land. Then something changes. Maybe a drought, maybe war, maybe disease, maybe a collapse of trade that made this settlement possible. People leave, or their numbers shrink, they stop clearing, they stop burning, and slowly the forest returns. And in the sediment record you see it. Forest pollen increases, charcoal decreases, sediment stabilizes. It's like watching a ghost town regrow into wilderness. But you're not watching with your eyes. You're watching through chemistry, through pollen grains so small you need a microscope, through time compressed into layers. And when you see it, you realize something about lost civilizations. Sometimes they don't vanish in fire. They vanish in quiet. They stop. They thin out. They become fewer. And the landscape reclaims the spaces they made. So when later people arrive, they see forest and assume it has always been forest. But the lake remembers. The lake knows the forest was once farmland. The lake knows the fire patterns changed. The lake knows humans were here. Now let's bring in another kind of record. Isotopes in human bones. Because the body itself carries a dietary signature. The ratio of certain isotopes in bone collagen can reveal what kinds of foods a person ate. More marine, more terrestrial, more plant-based, more animal-based. Teeth can preserve signals of childhood diet and migration. Strontium isotopes, for example, can reflect the geology of the region where a person grew up. so a skeleton can tell you if someone was local or moved from far away. This is astonishing when you think about it. A person who lived thousands of years ago, who left no written biography, can still tell you through their bones whether they grew up near limestone or volcanic rock, whether they ate fish or land animals, whether their childhood water came from one region and their adult life unfolded in another. So migration becomes visible again, not only through DNA but through geochemical fingerprints. And when you map those fingerprints across burials, you can see patterns. You can see whether a community was stable or mixed. You can see whether women moved into the community more than men, or vice versa, which can hint at social structures like patrilocality or matrilocality. You can see whether a region suddenly received many outsiders, which might align with a known collapse or conflict period. So even without texts, social dynamics leave traces, and those traces can be read. Now here's where the recovery of the past begins to feel almost like a paradox. The more tools we have, the more complex the story becomes. We don't get a single clear narrative. We get a network of partial truths, signals that sometimes align, sometimes contradict, sometimes point in different directions. And that can be frustrating if you want certainty. But if you want the real texture of history, it's actually closer to how the past would have felt to the people living it. Because they didn't know the future either. They didn't have neat narratives. They had weather. They had rumours. They had hunger. They had fear. They had decisions made with partial information. So in a strange way, the fragmentary nature of scientific reconstruction is appropriate. It mirrors the fragmentary nature of lived experience. Now let's bring the camera back out wide again. Because there is a larger implication to all of this. If we can recover so much without texts, then the missing ages might not be as empty as we once believed. Not in the sense that there were always lost high-tech civilizations everywhere. That's an extraordinary claim, and it requires extraordinary evidence. But in the sense that the human past was more populated, more dynamic, more networked, more variable than the written record alone suggests. There were more people living in places we thought were marginal. There were more migrations than we assumed. There were more collapses, more recoveries, more local experiments in social structure and technology. And when you think about it that way, you begin to see the past as a vast field of human possibility. Not a straight line, a landscape, full of paths, some taken, some abandoned, some erased. Now, hold on to that, because it sets up the next part of the story, the uncomfortable mirror. Because once you understand how knowledge is preserved, you also understand how knowledge can be lost, and not only in ancient times, in modern times too. We like to think our age is immune. We have servers, databases, backups, clouds, global distribution, redundancy. We have so much information it feels impossible for it to vanish. But the Bronze Age also felt stable to the people living in it. A world of palaces and trade, of scribes and diplomats. It was the known world, and then it unravelled. So the question becomes, what does unravelling look like now? Not necessarily as a dramatic collapse, not necessarily as a global catastrophe, but as a slow erosion of continuity, a drift into incompatibility, a loss of readability, a future where our archives exist but cannot be accessed because the machines that read them are gone, or the formats are obsolete, or the keys are lost, or the power grid is unreliable, or the institutions that maintain them have failed. And the eeriest part is that we already have a word for this phenomenon. Digital decay, bit rot, obsolescence, the slow death of data when it is not actively maintained. Because unlike clay tablets and stone inscriptions, digital information is not stable by default. It is stable only as long as the system that supports it stays alive. A hard drive sitting untouched does not become an archive. It becomes a graveyard of magnetic patterns slowly degrading. A file format not supported becomes unreadable. A password lost becomes a sealed vault. A company shutting down can wipe entire libraries stored on its servers. A change in standards can break compatibility. A failure of institutional memory can make old data meaningless because no one remembers what the categories meant. So the modern world has created a new kind of vulnerability. A vulnerability that doesn't require fire. It doesn't require conquest. It requires neglect. And we are very good at neglect because we are always moving forward, always chasing the new. We update, we replace, we abandon. And in that behavior, you can already see the mechanism of forgetting beginning to form again. But we're not going to rush into that yet, because before we step fully into the modern mirror, it's worth lingering a little longer in the recovery, in the strange, hopeful fact that even when humans forget, the earth remembers in its own language, and that language can be learned, and every time it is learned, a fragment of the lost world speaks again, not loudly, not as a triumphant revelation, but as a soft correction, a reminder that history is bigger than our stories about it. So keep listening. Let the noise of the day fade. Because what we're really doing here is learning to hear the quietest voices in the archive, the voices that survive not in ink but in dust, the voices that survive not in ink but in dust, dust on a floor that once held footsteps, dust in a lake bed that once caught the runoff from farms and roads, dust trapped inside ice, carried there by winds that blew over worlds that no longer exist. Dust is humble. It feels like nothing. It clings to windowsills. It gathers in corners. It drifts through shafts of light and disappears when you stop looking. But dust is a messenger, because dust is what remains when structure breaks down. It is what stone becomes when time keeps pressing. It is what wood becomes when fungi finish their work. It is what cities become when roofs collapse and plants move in. And in that sense, dust is a kind of summary, a compressed history. Everything ground down into particles so small they can travel, so small they can settle, so small they can be trapped in layers and kept. And now, in this era, we're learning how to read those particles, how to ask them questions. We can look at a single layer of sediment and see a sudden spike in charcoal and know that fire became common. We can look at a sudden change in pollen and know that forests retreated. We can find a thin band of volcanic ash and match it to an eruption that darkened the sky across continents. We can find a change in isotopes and infotemperature shifts that shaped harvests and migrations. We can extract fragments of DNA and watch populations move like currents, blending, separating, arriving, vanishing. None of it gives us a perfect story, but it gives us something better than a myth. It gives us a textured outline. It gives us a map of possibility. And it gives us a warning, quietly embedded in the method itself. Because if we can recover the past only by learning the Earth's language, it means the human language failed to preserve it. The writing stopped, the schools stopped, the copying stopped, the apprenticeships stopped, the chain broke, and the Earth, indifferent, patient, kept recording anyway. So the mystery of missing ages is not only the mystery of what happened back then, it is the mystery of why human continuity is so fragile, why we build and then lose the ability to explain what we built, why a civilization can stand at the edge of extraordinary complexity and then, within a few generations, forget the steps that led there. We like to tell ourselves that progress is a staircase, but history, if you watch it honestly, looks more like breathing. Inhale, expansion, trade, surplus, specialization, writing, institutions, exhale, contraction, fracture, local survival, loss of specialists, silence. Inhale again, rebuilding, rediscovery, new networks, new methods. Exhale again, collapse, erasure, drift. And in that rhythm, the human story becomes less like a march and more like a pulse. Now, you might wonder what it feels like to live inside one of those pulses. It rarely feels like collapse. To the people inside it, it feels like normal life becoming narrower, like choices shrinking, like travel becoming harder, like the future feeling less predictable, like the cost of things rising not only in money but in risk, like knowledge turning into a luxury. And that is where the real danger lives. Not in the dramatic moment when a city burns, but in the long period after, when people stop maintaining what they can no longer afford. Because maintenance is what keeps a world readable. It keeps roads clear. It keeps water systems functioning. It keeps archives dry. It keeps languages taught. It keeps standards consistent. It keeps complex projects alive across generations. And maintenance is always the first thing to be cut when survival tightens. So when you look at the past through the Earth's archives, you begin to see a pattern that doesn't care about era. When systems are stable, knowledge accumulates. When systems destabilize, knowledge leaks away. And that brings us gently to the uncomfortable mirror, the modern world, the world you live in now, the world that feels, at a glance, like it has escaped the fragility of ancient times. We have satellites. We have databases. We have libraries that can fit inside your pocket. We have communication that crosses the planet in seconds. We have redundancy, backups, copies, clouds. We have so much information that it feels absurd to even imagine losing it. And yet, the more you understand how knowledge is preserved, the more you realize that the modern world has created a new kind of vulnerability. Because in the ancient world, knowledge was often stored in material forms that could be read directly by another human. A clay tablet does not require electricity. A stone inscription does not require a subscription. A book does not require a company to remain profitable. If you can see it, and you can read the language, you can access it. But digital memory is different. Digital memory is not a thing you own in the same way. It is a relationship, a chain of dependencies. It lives on devices that require power. It lives in formats that require software. It lives in systems that require maintenance. It lives in clouds that are not clouds at all, but data centers with fans, cooling systems, staff, contracts, budgets, political stability. And every link in that chain is a point of failure. A file can survive on a hard drive physically and still be dead because the format is obsolete. A photograph can exist in a backup and still be unreachable because the password is lost. An archive can sit intact on a server and still vanish because the company shutters and wipes storage. A civilization can record more than any civilization ever recorded, and still become unreadable if the infrastructure that decodes it collapses. This is not speculation. It is already happening in small ways. Think about old discs you can't read anymore, old tapes, old file types, old software that no longer runs, old websites that vanished, old photos locked behind dead accounts. Old data lost when a platform changed terms or simply disappeared. We call it digital decay, but that phrase is almost too gentle. Because what it really means is this. The modern world is creating a vast library written in a language that requires a living machine to interpret. And machines are not immortal. They are hungry. They require resources. They require stable supply chains. They require political order. They require people with specialized knowledge to maintain them. And those people, like the Bronze Age scribes, like the palace administrators, like the master craftsmen, are nodes in a fragile network. So the modern world is not outside the old pattern, it is inside it. It is repeating it, but with different materials. Instead of clay tablets, we have magnetic storage. Instead of stone, we have silicon. Instead of scribes, we have engineers. Instead of palaces, we have data centers and corporations. And the deeper lesson is not, the future will collapse. The lesson is simpler. The lesson is that memory is expensive. It always has been. It costs effort. It costs stability. It costs maintenance. And when we stop paying those costs, the bill arrives in silence. Now, this might sound bleak, but it isn't meant to be. Because the same knowledge that reveals vulnerability also reveals agency. Once you understand the mechanisms of forgetting, you can build against them. Not perfectly, not forever, but better. Cultures have always tried. That's why they carved in stone. That's why they buried time capsules. That's why they copied manuscripts again and again. That's why they built institutions whose purpose was continuity. And now, in our era, we are faced with the same task, only with different tools. We have to decide what we want to survive. Not as content, as readable content, accessible content, and that means formats that can be decoded. Redundancy that does not depend on a single platform. Archives that can outlive business models. Knowledge that is not trapped behind passwords no one will remember. Languages that continue to be taught. And perhaps most importantly, practices that continue to be practiced. Because the most durable knowledge is not always the knowledge stored in an archive. It is the knowledge stored in habits, in crafts, in living traditions, in the hands of people who can do something, not just describe it. Because description is fragile, but practice can survive even when paper burns. This is why some ancient technologies persisted through collapse. Not because they were written down perfectly, but because someone knew how to do them. Someone taught someone else. The fire moved to a new hearth. So if you want a final image for this entire journey, let it be that again. A fire, not as romance, as function. A living thing that must be carried. You don't preserve a fire by admiring it. You preserve it by feeding it, by protecting the embers, by teaching someone else how to coax it back from ash. And knowledge is like that. It is carried forward by attention, by repetition, by teaching, by institutions when we have them, and by human relationships when we don't. Now, as you lie there, listening, you might realize something quietly profound. You are part of that chain, not in a grand, heroic way, in a simple way. Every time you learn something and hold it, every time you share something you understand, every time you keep a memory alive in your own mind and you pass it forward, through conversation, through writing, through work, through care, you are doing what humans have always done against the dark. You are keeping a flame from going out. And that means the study of missing ages isn't only about the past, it's also about the present. It's about how fragile continuity is and how precious. It's about recognizing that our confidence is often based on the illusion of permanence. And once you see that, you become gentler with the past. You stop mocking lost people as if they were foolish for forgetting. You understand that forgetting is the default, remembering is the achievement. So when you see a civilization's knowledge evaporate, you don't need to imagine incompetence. You imagine pressure, you imagine hunger, war, disease, drought, disruption. You imagine the network breaking, and you imagine people doing what humans always do when the network breaks. They survive, they narrow their world, they carry what they can. They let the rest go. And later, we call it a dark age because our documents go quiet. But in the lived world, it was not darkness, it was life, stripped down. It was children still being born. It was old people still being cared for. It was stories still being told around smaller fires. It was the human mind doing its ancient work, adapting, again, to whatever the planet demanded. So perhaps the most honest way to speak about missing ages is not to speak about them as emptiness, but as distance, as a gap between what happened and what we can recover, a gap created not only by time, but by the fragility of the mediums we used. And now, in this moment, as you drift closer to sleep, you can let that gap exist without trying to fill it with certainty. Because not knowing everything is not failure. It's the natural state of a species that has lived for hundreds of thousands of years and recorded only a fraction of its own experience. The miracle is that we know anything at all, that we can drill into ice and pull up ancient air, that we can scan forests and reveal buried cities, that we can read pollen grains and see the rise and fall of agriculture, that we can extract DNA and watch migrations unfold, that we can bring faint erased ink back into view and hear a voice that was supposed to be silent. These are not small things. They are acts of recovery, acts of listening, acts of humility. And they remind you of something that might help you sleep. The world is bigger than your worries, not in a dismissive way, in a comforting way. Your mind is carrying modern concerns, modern stress, modern noise. But beneath that, your body is ancient. Your nervous system is built for cycles, light and dark, effort and rest, hunger and fullness, danger and safety. And right now, in this moment, you are safe enough to rest. So let the last thought be simple. History is not a straight line. It is a field of fires, some extinguished, some still burning. And you're here, warm, breathing, listening, carrying a small ember of curiosity in your chest. You don't have to solve the mystery tonight. You don't have to reconstruct the missing ages. You only have to let your mind loosen its grip. Let your body do what it was designed to do when the day is over. To lower the guard, to soften the muscles, to slow the breath, to slip into the old darkness that is not frightening when you are sheltered. Darkness as rest, darkness as repair, darkness as the quiet place where the brain rearranges fragments into meaning. So let the earth keep its archive, let the past remain vast, let the unanswered questions exist like distant stars, real, present, but not urgent, and let your own small corner of the world become quiet now, breath by breath, minute by minute, until thought becomes softer than dust and you drift,